Hello everyone and welcome back to Crosses Gaming. Today we're going to take a look at The Surge. This hardcore third-person view RPG aspires to challenge Dark Souls for its position at the throne of hardcore action RPGs. You will become an employee of Creo, a futuristic company providing their employees with exoskeletons, and you will have to fight your way through unforgiving enemies that include other humans and exoskeletons, giant robots, and even new sentient life forms. You can buy it on Steam for €49.99, your regional equivalent. So, anyone watching my channel knows that I've already sank a pretty decent amount of time into The Surge, and I have been enjoying it quite a lot, especially for it being my first time sinking into these Dark Soulsy games, as I hadn't played any of the Dark Souls games previously. I have currently about 12 hours spent in game, split between two separate playthroughs, one for my Let's Play series and one for my own personal time because I like the game so much and, well, I just cannot record all the time. But let's get straight into the review. And as usual, we will start with how the game actually plays. At its core, this is a game I would have very much had a love-hate relationship when I was about 16 years old, as that was the time I seriously loved playing third-person RPGs, sinking hundreds and hundreds of hours into games like Gothic, Oblivion, and similar. And Surge plays very similarly to those, but just takes the difficulty and says, screw you if you aren't good. And as far as I know, that's exactly what people love about these super hardcore RPGs. The fact that it's all up to you. Either you are good and you do well in game, or you just need to get good. For Pete's sake, it's even a meme these days. And the combat in The Surge is exactly that. Enemies that deal massive amounts of damage to you unless you know how to avoid taking damage altogether. But at the same time, you always have the chance to avoid it, making the game incredibly satisfying even when fighting regular enemies. Especially the first time you will encounter a new enemy type, you are very likely to have problems fighting, and at the very least you're almost certain to take at least a bit of damage, and probably even more likely just to die to them. Enemies can be essentially put into two categories. They can be then each divided into two further subcategories. The first one are regular enemies that come in two major forms. Zombified humans that are in my opinion a bit easier to fight because they seem to be a bit more clear about the signals that they are giving out. The other type are robots that you will encounter, either in form of drones flying around or ground-based robots. These seem to be giving me much more issues than the humans, whereas because the drones can sometimes be ranged and just firing you from range while you fight other enemies, disturbing your fight and making you die to an enemy you have already thought you have mastered, or because their signals seem to be much less pronounced than the ones from the humans. The second category are bosses. And as with the regular enemies, these come in two subcategories: mini-bosses and the actual big baddies, the real bosses. Mini-bosses are usually just sprinkled somewhere around the level, either guarding a bit of loot or preventing you from going further, forcing you to defeat them to progress. These will usually require at least a few tries for you to defeat them, but generally, their signaling is quite visible, and if you're patient and don't rush it, you should be able to deal with them without that much trouble. But then we have the real bosses. You will find one in each zone, and these are big ass robots or even other things that will almost certainly require a decent amount of tries from you to kill them. They have many different attacks that deal massive amounts of damage, and if you aren't super careful while fighting them, you are guaranteed to die quickly. Now, do I like or do I dislike the enemies? For the most part, I like them. They have different distinct fighting styles based on the weapons they are using, and the fact that you can easily see the weapon they are using allows you to predict what sort of fight you're going in to be when you go into fighting. But on the other hand, the enemies do repeat a bit too much in my opinion. For example, in the very first zone, there is a grand total of 5 enemy types, and the vast majority of them is just one of these types. And 2 of the types are one mini-boss and the boss of the zone, so most of the time you will be just fighting one single enemy type, and while even it has a quite decent amount of attack patterns, I still feel like this isn't really enough. Plus, from a visual standpoint, almost all human enemies look very similar. So that's probably enough about the enemies. We should talk at least a bit about your character and how it feels while fighting them. Compared to Dark Souls, the fighting in The Surge might seem as somewhat simplistic. You don't have any sort of light or strong attack variants. The only way to differentiate your own attacks is with either a vertical or a horizontal attack. But these can be later chained into different combos. The other thing that you can do is to specifically target different parts of your enemies, like their limbs, for human enemies, or just their robotic parts. And if you manage to hit these enough times in a single encounter, you will be able to execute a finishing move, cutting that particular part of enemy off. And if you do this to human enemies, this will provide with blueprints for new gear and the materials you need to craft said gear. Apart from attacking, you can also block and dodge enemy attacks. And trust me, you want to do this a lot. It is very common in this hardcore combat genre. Even the regular enemies will quickly kill you unless you are very cautious. Blocking isn't really that useful for the most part, as many of the enemy's attacks can go through blocking anyways. I personally have found it only to be useful against enemies using twin rigged weapons, because they attack very quickly and will engage you from a pretty long distance. Anyways, if you manage to get a perfect block and you immediately attack after performing it, you will get a special attack in, dealing a pretty high amount of damage. The second way to avoid damage is by dodging away from enemy attacks. And honestly, especially when encountering new enemies, you might find yourself doing this more than actually attacking. Dodging is the same thing as in so many games these days. You just jump away and wait for an opportunity to strike yourself. But remember, you still need stamina to dodge, so you should always have at least a bit of stamina left so you don't just die because you couldn't dodge. Again, we are faced with the question of whether I think the combat is good or bad. And this time I have to answer with a definitive yes. It feels incredibly satisfying and all the weapons do have a great feel to them. I personally have found that I enjoy the game best using medium speed weapons, giving me the option to perform both quick series of attacks or just harass the enemy while keeping my distance most of the time, if I'm not sure what their patterns are yet. The only thing I would love to see is the inclusion of light and strong attacks, but the combo system does supplement this missing element quite well. So now let's talk about the equipment you can find and about crafting. Right now, there are about 12 different armor sets in the game, each providing a different bonus, from making your attacks quicker at high health to gear that provides you with passive health regeneration, well, with the exception of 2 sets that both share the same bonus. This means you can customize your character very much to your liking, and I'm sure there will be many more sets coming in the future so you can customize even further. The one thing I don't like that much about the armor sets is that you're pretty much required to use a full set of gear, otherwise you're missing on a very big bonus, and the individual pieces of armor aren't powerful on their own and don't come with any interesting mechanics on their own. To get these armor pieces, you first need to collect the blueprints by cutting them off of enemies, then you need to gather enough tech scraps, essentially the souls of the game, and then gather a few materials for that particular piece of armor you want to craft. The materials are again gathered by cutting pieces of armor you want of enemies, but this time it doesn't really matter what type of enemy you're cutting it off. Then we have the weapons. You cannot craft weapons as far as I know. You can only get them by cutting them off enemies, getting them after boss battles, or at very rare occasions, you just find them as pieces of loot. But I think that has only happened to me once in the whole game. The weapons are divided into several categories: one-handed, staves, heavy-duty, single-rigged, and twin-rigged weapons. But since single-rigged and heavy-duty weapons and then staves and one-handed weapons have both sort of a similar attack style, you essentially have only 3 types of combat available to you: low speed, medium speed, and high speed combat. I found myself liking the medium speed weapons the most, as I already mentioned, but I also spent some time using the high speed and low speed weapons, but I always felt like I have been missing about a bit. Well, the medium weapons seem to have a good balance of both speed and impact for my personal use. All of this gear can be further upgraded in Ops, which is essentially the bonfire of this series, but much more sparsely encountered than in Dark Souls, as there is only one for each region, but then you also need to remember that the maps essentially always circle around, taking you back to Ops and giving you access to more and more shortcut as you progress. But back to crafting. At Ops, you have a machine where you can first of all recycle all the wrecked pieces of armor you have cut of enemies, turning them into components for crafting. Then you can craft the individual pieces of armor here, and lastly, you can upgrade them here as well. Upgrades are pretty boring to be honest, as they only provide a slight stat increase and don't make the armor have any additional effects. So the gear, weapons, and crafting are probably the weakest point of the game right now. First of all, and I'm begging the devs, please make the armor more meaningful. Give them more effects than just pure statistics and allow us to mismatch different armor sets without feeling gimped. The crafting interface is also really bad. I'm 100% sure that this is because the game interface has been largely developed with consoles in mind, but on a PC, it could have been done in a fashion that wouldn't feel like you're always searching for more information. It sort of reminds me of the UI issues Skyrim has without modding it. And add a bit more variety in weapons, giving them the effects the same way I wish gear would have them as well. The only other thing that will make you sometimes angry at this game is its occasionally inconsistency when enemies target you, and the fact that sometimes they will just move at incredible speeds. The targeting thing seems to happen when you just go a centimeter closer to an enemy before you did, and now he targets you and previously didn't. But that's not really an issue most of the time, since you can just go around this by killing the enemies you were planning to avoid anyways. The bigger issue is that sometimes enemies will just come at you at much higher speed than they usually do. This seems to be the case whenever the padding is weird and they essentially have to compensate for this. Luckily, this doesn't happen really often. But altogether, the Surge is very much fun to play. There are certainly improvements that could help it stand out even more, but the core gameplay loop is so satisfying to play that you will be very much willing to forgive those issues. Plus, many of them can be pretty easily solved with either a few patches or future content, either in form of DLCs or full-blown expansions. Okay, that's it for the gameplay part of the review. Now we should take a look at the graphics. And as you can see from the footage, the game looks quite stunning. The visual style might not be as dark and grim as it is in Dark Souls, but I love the style that aims towards exoskeletons that look almost like mechs and these highly futuristic weapons and robots in general. Apart from the fact that everyone is trying to kill you, this is pretty much how I imagine the future in 30-40 years. Plus, I don't think we will have AI to be honest. The only problem with the graphics is the camera. For the most part, it works fine, but whenever you're fighting bosses, it might actually be a good idea to often switch between free and targeted camera, as the targeted camera might screw you up royally, as you won't see where you're currently running because you don't want to be looking behind you as you're running away from the boss. But the models are awesome and high detailed. All the animations, especially the finisher moves, look super awesome, and even the lighting and particle effects complement the general theme of the game very well. The only thing that could improve them would be a bit more distinctiveness in how the humans enemies look, since they all look pretty much the same. But otherwise, I think the Surge looks very much awesome. Sounds in the Surge are executed very well as well. Each time you attack, you can almost feel the weapons and armor clashing, adding a very nice feeling to the combat. On the other hand, the music seems to be a bit underperforming in my opinion. It's not bad, but for this caliber of a game, I would have thought it would have been somewhat more, let's call it impactful. This game just begs for a thrash metal soundtrack, and sadly, we didn't get it. Performance-wise, The Surge performed quite well. The frame rates were high, and I didn't even encounter any staggering. I did have the game crash once, but I'm pretty sure that was the issue with my computer overheating on a very hot day and me forgetting to set the fans from my idle settings to the gaming settings, so no complaints here. So, in conclusion, The Surge is more than a competent new contestant in the genre of hardcore action RPGs. It provides a completely different setting than any of the previous games in this genre, and I love that. The combat feels great, and defeating every single enemy is more than satisfying. There are a few issues that need to be solved, especially the enemies not behaving always predictably, but I'm sure these small issues will be solved in no time. The $50 price tag is a bit high in my opinion, but if you're a fan of the genre, it is well worth it. For people who like the genre a bit more casually, waiting for a sale might be worth it, but even then, paying the full price won't make you feel like you spent money wrongly. Well, that's it for today, guys. Hope you liked the review, and if you did, please consider liking it, subscribing to my channel for more gaming reviews, or comment if you had something you would like to add. And if you didn't like the video, well, dislike it. See you all next time with more gaming content.